Some people think that the disciples couldn't have remembered Jesus' teachings long enough for those who were writing down the Gospels to have gotten the information. Now, I think that's rather a curious argument, and especially for those of us who teach students and hope that decades from now, students will still be able to draw on lessons that we taught. Mark is probably the first gospel written, or at least the first surviving gospel written, and the usual consensus dating of critical scholarship is around 40 years after Jesus' public ministry. I tend to date it a little bit earlier, some people tend to date it a little bit later, but it's around 40 years. Now, if you are less than 40 years old, you probably don't remember anything personally that's more than 40 years ago. But for those of us who are well over 40, we can often remember some things going back 40 years pretty well. I was at my 40th high school reunion, and a classmate from third grade still remembered something I did in third grade that she found very entertaining, and she told it to her husband, to whom she introduced me, who was like, "Oh yeah, she told me about you." And I remembered it because I was hugely embarrassed, I guess traumatized. So, there are certain things that we do remember for a long time, and those, in this case, I'm talking about episodic memory, or like the memory of our experiences. But there's also semantic memory, where you remember something, information that you learned, and that also can last for a long time. Now, with episodic memory, both personally and collectively, in terms of collective memory, that often gets condensed, just the same way you have video compression algorithms that can reduce the size of a file for online. Memory works the same way. So you may remember a few details here and there, but you get pretty much a condensed version of the story. And especially if you tell it over and over again, the form in which you tell it will often be the form in which you continue to remember it and continue to tell it. Now, what is the relevance of that to the eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry? Well, disciples' main responsibility was to remember and pass on what their teacher taught them. And that's true both in schools that were primarily around written texts and schools that were primarily focused on oral remembering, just hearing things, whether the people were literate or not. So what we have are people who are disciples, who are trained by hearing their teacher teach certain ideas over and over again to remember those ideas, who have witnessed certain experiences that they've had with Jesus a number of times. They're going to be able to remember those things. And disciples would often collectively remember things and put them together. And you can be sure that since these disciples also became leaders in the churches, and we know that, for example, from Galatians, that around the year 50, the leaders in the Jerusalem church are especially Peter and John, who were very close to Jesus, and then James, the brother of Jesus, who might know a little bit about his background from maybe his mom or something, that these people were in leadership. So they were the ones people looked to. The standard in antiquity, when people would write history or record events, they would try to go to the horse's mouth. They would want to hear from the original witnesses, or at least from those who heard the original witnesses when possible. Oral historians tell us that this is the period in which memory is most accurate. That is the period of living memory, the period when eyewitnesses or those who knew them are still alive, normally 60 to 80 years. That fits all of our first century Gospels by definition. It doesn't fit the later Gospels. Gospel of Thomas, maybe around 140, some date it later, or Gospels written around 170 and later. The so-called lost Gospels weren't lost; they were discarded by the mainstream church, by the majority of the church, the consensus view of the church throughout the Roman Empire, because they had a standard that's a good historical standard. It needs to be from the first century. It needs to be from eyewitnesses or from their circle, and it needs to be consistent with what the eyewitnesses or their circle taught. Well, that kind of limits it among surviving sources to the four Gospels. And also, before the Gospel of Mark, there's a source that's a common source used by Matthew and Luke. This one is not agreed on by all scholars, but a majority of scholars who very creatively call it source, using the German name for that Quelle, abbreviated as Q. But whether you agree with calling it Q or not, you've got this material that is shared by Matthew and Luke. And then you have some quotations by Paul of Jesus, quotations, as you can tell by Old Testament quotations of the New Testament. It doesn't have to be verbatim. But the form in which it appears, for example, in 1 Corinthians, you have some sayings of Jesus. 1 Corinthians is written around the year 53, so maybe somewhere around 23 years after Jesus' public ministry. You've got sayings that fit the Q form, as well as sayings that fit Mark, which is written probably later than 1 Corinthians. Well, that suggests that the either orally or possibly in written form, because Matthew and Luke are often following the same sequence, we have this material circulating at the time when these close to Jesus people were the leading figures in the early church. That suggests, yes, a lot of stuff was being remembered. Now, people will often object, no, I don't think so, because there's so many frailties in memory. Well, they're absolutely right about the frailties in memory, and I can certainly attest that. In fact, as an absent-minded professor, I can certainly exemplify that, sometimes in front of my own students. But having said that, these memory frailties are often matters of detail, matters of chronology, and so on. I mean, we can say what they are. They don't tend to be matters so much of the gist of something. Verbatim memory is, may last a few seconds. You can demonstrate this by, well, today people can usually copy and paste documents, but what we had to do back in antiquity, back 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we would, we want to make sure we get the quote right, so we're typing the quote. We keep looking back, and yeah, in my own case, there will be times when what I think it says, I've already paraphrased in my head, because what I remember longer is the gist. Well, even with the gist, you're not going to remember everything. Nobody remembers what they had. Well, most people won't remember what they had for lunch on this day last year, unless say it was your birthday or you eat the same thing every day. You're not going to remember every conversation that you ever had. But you'll remember certain things. And you'll remember often the things that are most important to you, that make the biggest impact on you. Jesus' disciples may not have remembered every time he raised somebody from the dead, but chances are the first few occasions probably made a big impression on them. And as far as teachings, disciples of teachers were supposed to practice those teachings over and over. Now, in terms of getting it verbatim, that usually only happens with aphorisms or things like proverbs. Like in English, haste makes waste. In antiquity, it would be something like render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. Striking statements like that, those tend to be more alike from one gospel to another. But in terms of the stories, like the parables, from one gospel to another, you don't find the wording exactly the same. And it can vary considerably and still give the same story. If I tell my kids the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, I'm not going to tell the story in the same wording every time. Now, if I diverge radically, and one time I say, and the big bear came and ate up Goldilocks, they're going to say, that's not how it goes. But if I just use different wording, no problem. Nobody expected verbatim wording in antiquity, and when you compare the Gospels, you don't find verbatim wording from one Gospel to another, because again, that wasn't the expectation. And they had freedom to say kingdom of God, or in Matthew, kingdom of heaven. Those are things that you can very well expect. But in terms of remembering the gist, the things that are important to us, well, we may remember those. And after 5 years, we may remember only half the things that we thought were major things to us during the year that they happened. But the forgetting curve in long-term memory seems to go down after about 5 years, so that really significant things you may still remember 40 or 50 years later, barring the kinds of problems with the brain that sometimes happens when we get older. In terms of how accurate memory could be, there are people who don't even know Arabic, who, because of their Islamic faith, memorize the entire Quran in Arabic. This was true of Christian monks, some of whom were illiterate, who would be expected to memorize Psalms or memorize one of the Gospels straight up before they learned how to read and write. This was also characteristic in early Judaism. We have it demonstrated elaborately in the rabbis. Some people say, well, that material is later. Fine. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, who was already alive before the year 70, talks about how Jewish boys were taught to recite Torah. They were taught to learn the Torah. Many Greeks learned large parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in fact, you had traveling bards who were illiterate, who could recite all of the Iliad and the Odyssey by heart. And this is well documented in ancient sources. Now, you have some people whose memory was really striking, like Seneca the Elder. Seneca the Elder says, when I was younger, I could meet 2,000 people and then repeat back their names in exactly the order in which I just met them. You could give me 200 verses, and I could repeat them back in reverse order. That's quite a memory. That's the kind of people who memorize telephone books today to get into Guinness Book of World Records just to show off, or memorize pi to like a few thousand decimal digits. But Seneca says, now I'm old, I can't remember that much, but let me just tell you, since you're impressed by all these orators that I went to oratory school with, let me just give you samples of their oratorical speeches, or practice declamation speeches that we gave in rhetorical school. And he proceeds to give examples from about 100 speeches from rhetorical school. Now, I am not on the level of Seneca the Elder. But what it does, it illustrates how significant memorization was in antiquity. If you had any education at all, it was the way you learned at the most basic level. It was also how advanced disciples learned. Again, whether they were literate or not. Their literacy is a red herring because, as soon as you have the followers of Jesus growing, you're going to have some people who are able to write stuff down. And normally, teachers weren't expected to write the things down. Their students were expected to write things down for them. That had been true for about 5 centuries by the time that the Gospels were written. But even though Seneca the Elder was like, the phone book memorization guy, you still have a lot of other people with really good memories. So one guy goes into an auction, and at the end of the day, he can repeat back every item that was sold, the person to whom it was sold, and the price for which it was sold with no notes. I cheat when I teach. I usually use PowerPoint and peek at my slides. Today, we don't have that same kind of emphasis, usually, in our culture in the U.S. We have kind of our corporate memory in Google, on the cloud. Woe to us if the power grid goes down and we can't access it. But anyway, you have another person who went to a poetry reading, and after the person up front had read the poem, he said, "Wait, you plagiarized that. That's my poem. I can prove it. I can repeat it back from memory." He proceeds to repeat it back from memory. And just as the room is filling with anxiety and confusion, he says, "Ha ha, just kidding. I just wanted to show you how good my memory was. I memorized it while you were reading it." Well, Middle Eastern memory has often been emphatic on that as well. I have a friend from Lebanon who was telling me, things are changing now with Western influence, but memorization was very key to learning when he was growing up. And one of the poems that they had to memorize was a poem about a poet. This was an Arabian princess. She was a great poetess. And she said, "I will marry," and of course that meant make somebody a prince. "I will marry the best poet in Arabia." And so all the poets were making their way to her Arabian kingdom so they could recite their poetry before her. Well, one poet had a really good poem, but he made the mistake of reciting it to the person who was traveling with him. And the person who was traveling with him said, "That's a really good poem," and then killed the original poet because he'd memorized it as the other was reciting it. He got before the princess, and he recited this poem. But like an idiot, he didn't make any adjustments. The poem identified the place of origin of the original poet, but the accent of the person who was reciting the poem gave away that he was from a different place, whereupon the princess said, "Take this man away. He is my husband's murderer." She figured it out. Moral of the story is, don't plagiarize, as I always tell my students. In Western culture, sometimes this seems inconceivable, even to me when I'm grading midterms. But it's not always been that way, even in Western culture. Anna Gulick, who was a professor of French at Asbury University, an Anglican deacon, she passed away a few years ago at the age of 96. And Anna told me that when she was growing up, their home didn't have even radio. They didn't have television, and they certainly didn't have air conditioning. So they would sit out on the front porch, and they would tell stories from their family that went back generations, because this had been customary in our culture to pass on stories from the family going way back. And she told me stories that went back even to the 1700s, which I was later able to check on Google. But she was blind, so she couldn't really check it herself. But I was able to confirm that, yeah, some of these memories went back pretty far. Well, we're not talking about memories in the case of the Gospels that go back for centuries. We're talking about memories that go back for decades, within the lifetime, potentially, of eyewitnesses. And so to say, nobody can remember something from 50 years ago, depending on your age, maybe you can ask your parents about their wedding. And if your parents were married 50 years ago, or your grandparents were married 50 years ago, again, depending on your age, and they're telling you something, you probably don't want to say, nobody can remember something for 50 years. I want to see your wedding certificate.